Please subscribe to this channel for more videos related to Catholic Christian teaching. The Council of Trent, in opposition to Pelagianism and to modern rationalism, teaches, if anyone does not confess that Adam, the first man, by transgressing God's commandment in paradise, at once lost the holiness and justice in which he had been constituted, let him be anathema. Pelagianism is a doctrine that emphasizes humans' ability to achieve salvation through their own efforts without divine grace. Modern rationalism teaches that what we know comes from reason. In philosophy, this approach is often understood in contrast to the view that what we know comes from sense experience as taught by empiricism. Against Bayes and the Jansenist Quesnel, who denied the role of free will in the acceptance and the use of grace, Jansenism asserts that God's role in the infusion of grace cannot be resisted and does not require human assent. The Church asserted the supernatural character of the gifts given to man in the primitive state. The elevation to the state of grace is indicated by the intimacy between God and the progenitors of the human race in paradise. A scriptural proof is provided by St. Paul's teaching on the redemption. The apostle teaches that Christ, the second Adam, restored what the first Adam had lost, the state of holiness and justice. But if he had lost it, he must previously have received it. The Fathers find the supernatural endowment with grace indicated in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, in Genesis chapter 2 verse 7, and in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 30. St. Augustine declares that our renewal consists in this, that we have received the justice that man had excluded by sin. St. John Damascene says, the Creator has communicated His divine grace to man and thereby made him a participant in His community. As regards the moment of man's elevation to the state of grace, most theologians, including St. Thomas and his school, are of the opinion that the first human beings were created in the state of sanctifying grace. Peter Lombard and the Franciscan school, on the other hand, teach that the first human beings on their creation received only the preternatural gifts of integrity and were required to prepare themselves with the help of actual grace for the reception of sanctifying grace. The Council of Trent deliberately left the question undecided. St. Thomas' teachings is that of the Fathers. In theology, the term preternatural is used to distinguish between supernatural and preternatural events. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that the supernatural consists in God's unmediated actions, while the preternatural is what happens rarely, but nonetheless by the agency of created beings. For example, angels are thought to have the preternatural power of flight, and Adam and Eve are said to have possessed the preternatural gift of immortality before the fall of man. The supernatural endowment of the first man included, in addition to the absolute supernatural gift of sanctifying grace, certain preternatural gifts of integrity. Concupiscence, in the dogmatic sense, is the spontaneous sensual and intellectual ambition which precedes the deliberation of the mind and decision of the will, and persists against the decision of the will. The gift of integrity consists in the perfect dominion of free will over sensual and intellectual ambition, but it allows the possibility of sin to remain. The Council of Trent explains that concupiscence was called a sin by St. Paul because it comes from sin and inclines towards sin. But if it flows from sin, then it did not exist before sin. Sacred Scripture attests to the perfect harmony between reason and sensuality. And they were both naked and were not ashamed. It was only sin that gave rise to the feeling of shame. The Fathers defend the gift of integrity against the Pelagians, who regarded concupiscence not as a defect of nature, but as a power of nature. St. Augustine teaches that the first man, by reason of the gift of integrity, had the possibility of easily avoiding sin. The Council of Trent teaches that Adam fell under the sentence of death as a punishment for sin. If anyone does not profess that Adam, the first man, through the offense of this sin, drew upon himself the wrath and indignation of God, and consequently death, with which God had threatened him, let him be anathema. Sacred Scripture records that God threatened and imposed death as punishment of the transgression of His probationary commandment. For God made not death, but by the envy of the devil, death came into the world. By one man, sin entered into the world, and by sin, death. As St. Augustine teaches, the gift of immortality is to be conceived as the possibility of not dying, not as the impossibility of dying. The Fathers regarded bodily immortality as being transmitted through the tree of life. Based on the principle that the sin did not change the nature of man, more recent theologians understand the gift of immortality as the prolonged duration of man's original state, so that he would not have experienced death so painfully as the guilty man does. The Council of Trent does not seem to contradict this when it thinks of empirical death as human beings actually experience it. With regard to Scripture, it should be noted that death is not just bodily death, but also the loss of friendship with God. The immortality bestowed on man is accordingly to be thought of as ongoing communion with God, in which the transfiguration of the body is included. The gift of freedom from suffering is to be more closely defined as the possibility of remaining free from suffering. It is associated with corporeal immortality. Sacred Scripture represents suffering and sorrow as the consequence of sin. Before sin came into the world, the progenitors of the human race lived in a condition of unalloyed happiness. But freedom from suffering is not in any way means inactivity. Our first parents, immediately after their creation by God, received from Him the order to till the land, and thus, in a limited measure, to participate in the work of the Creator. Since our first parents, according to sacred Scripture, entered into existence in an adult state and were the first teachers and educators of humanity, it was appropriate that they should be equipped by God with a natural knowledge suitable to their age and their tasks. And with that measure of supernatural knowledge which was necessary to enable them to achieve their supernatural destiny. In sacred Scripture, the deep knowledge of Adam is indicated in his naming of the animal and in his immediate knowledge of the status and tasks of the woman. The scholastics extend the knowledge of our first parents in an excessive fashion. Sacred Scripture provides no indication about this. The purpose of naming is to express the grandeur of man over the animals. The duration of the original state is not known by revelation. It is conceivable that the first act of man's free will was the sin. In this case, the original state would have been of very short duration. The Council of Trent teaches that Adam lost sanctity and sanctifying grace not merely for himself, but also for us. It follows from this that he received these not only for himself, but also for us, his descendants. The laws of sanctity and sanctifying grace, according to the unanimous teaching of the Fathers and the theologians, applies to the preternatural gifts of integrity, for these were bestowed for the sake of sanctifying grace. Adam received the gifts of the original state not as an individual person, but as head of the human race, and thus for the whole human race. They were a gift to human nature, and, according to the positive ordinance of God, were to be transmitted with nature to all the heirs of that nature. Original justice was intended to be hereditary justice. The Fathers declare that we, the posterity of Adam, received the grace of God gratuitously and lost it through sin. This manner of speaking presupposes that the original endowment with grace ought to pass from Adam to his posterity. Please go to YouTube Retiramentality channel, playlist Divine Act of Creation for the complete series of these materials.